Hey, so today we are doing the brain. Yep, the brain. We've done the skeletal system, joints, and we introduced the nervous system last time. So today we're going to go over a lot of material. Sorry, but we're doing the brain. It's one of the largest organs responsible for memory, intellect, ideas, and behavior. It's the center in which you catalog sensory information. So you catalog things. You integrate that information with previously recorded information, and you produce actions based on the results of that synthesis. So you take in information, you think about it, and you bring it back and forth between the different neurons in your brain, and then you send out output to your to muscles, primarily skeletal muscles, to of things to do and with that information. So maybe you see a lion running towards you and you go, oh, I recognize what that is. That's a lion. It has claws and teeth and I need to run. So then your brain sends signal to yourself to run. So, or so you remember, you not only see something, but you remember why you need to run away. So the brain is also connected within the bone, the skull, the cranium. And it's interesting, during development, the brain and the cranium grow simultaneously. So the shape of the cranium actually mirrors the shape of the brain. We'll actually look at later on in this presentation, we'll look at the brain inside the skull. Okay, next slide. There's 37 trillion cells in the human body. There's about 100 billion brain cells, neurons, and that's about 0.27, 0.3% of the cells in the body. Each neuron can be connected to up to 10,000 other neurons via the synapses, which we talked about what a synapse was last time. It's where where an axon comes together with another axon, or a cell body, or dendrites, or those kind of things. So you can have different synapses, and you can have there's estimated 1,000 trillion, which would be 1 quadrillion, synaptic connections in the brain. So a lot of neuron cells in the brain are talking to a lot of other neuron cells. And then in addition to neurons, there's all the neuroglial cells, and there's about 10 times as many of those as there are neurons, because you need a whole bunch of those to help support the neurons. So also during development, or actually throughout your life, the more a neuron connection is used, the stronger the connection between neurons becomes. So, which means the more responsive the postsynaptic neuron becomes, the amplitude of its response becomes larger. So if you keep reusing a connection, say you learn to play the piano, and you're hitting, using your index finger for certain key, various fingers for certain keys, and as you learn, it becomes you get muscle memory is what we call it. But you actually can measure that there's a more responsive postsynaptic neurons going to those muscles. There's also something interesting called synaptic pruning. When you age, the number of synapses, which are measured by the number of, they looked at the number of dendrite spikes and estimate this, and the number of synapses and neurons start being reduced somewhere in adolescence and continues on into your 20s. When you're born, like every single neuron is like looking to touch every other neuron, and they're all making these connections because they don't know which other neuron to connect to. And then as you learn, well, only these neurons need to go to this muscle, and these neurons need to go to this muscle, then some of the connections between some of those you don't need those anymore. So you get rid of those synapses, and that gives you a little more efficient brain. And next slide. So here's a picture of a 12 to 14 week old embryo where the nerve cells are proliferating at a rate of about 15 million an hour. You start off, you start off as this little neural tube. Well, you start off as a fertilized egg and develop through several cell divisions into this neural tube structure at about 3 weeks here. And you have a forebrain. You have forebrain up here, region, and you have future spinal cord here. So this is 3 weeks. About 3 months, you see there's a head structure. So the neural tube here, and I'll do it this way. So the neural tube goes, and then the top part, the forebrain, starts folding over. So you have this. I'll draw. So here's the rest of your body, and so this brain part folds over that way, and becomes the forebrain becomes the brain. So, and then you have at 6 months down here, and at 9 months you start seeing the little creases and folds that you normally associate with pictures of the brain that you guys have seen. Well, the thing I wanted to point out in this is that during pregnancy, nerve cells have to proliferate at a rate of like 250,000 per minute or 4,000 a second for the entire course of pregnancy in order to reach 100 billion nerve cells in 9 months. So you've gone from a 3 millimeter neural tube to the size of the brain we have at birth. So yay big, that kind of size. So one thing this points out to you, obviously, is that you need good nutrition during pregnancy because you're having to supply those nerve cells with energy, as well as lipid and protein and carbohydrates and all the other minerals and stuff to allow them to grow as fast as they need to grow. Because you're making 4,000 new neurons every second, and all the other parts of your body are also growing at a fast rate as well. So this just kind of drives home that you take your prenatal vitamins if you're pregnant, and if your wife is pregnant, encourage her to do that too. So next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about the brain structure and the function of the brain, and the major brain regions, and how the brain is protected. So we're going to talk about the cerebrum. We're going to talk about what's called the diencephalon, the brainstem, the cerebellum, and then we'll talk about protection of the brain. So the bones, meninges, and cerebrospinal fluid, and also ventricles of the brain. And we're going to talk about, in the cerebrum, we're going to talk about the gray and white matter, surface features, functional areas, and then I'll touch on encephalography, brain waves. And then we're going to talk diencephalon, and then the other 3 regions of the brain, diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. We're going to talk about the diencephalon, the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. Brainstem, we're going to talk about the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain, and then finally the cerebellum. And actually, I'm not going to go necessarily in this order. This is the order that's in your book. I'm going to actually go cerebrum, brainstem, cerebellum, and then diencephalon last. So just to mix it up a little, make it fun. So not really. I have a reason for doing it. Let's see. So these are the major brain regions: cerebrum, diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. And so here's, I'm going to draw a quick picture. So there's your brain, and let's do a different color. We'll do oops, if I can do it, diencephalon, and let's do green, and brainstem, and then my favorite color, we'll go to blue, and do the cerebellum is down here. So here we go. This is the cerebrum, and the diencephalon, and the brainstem, and the cerebellum there. So, and the good way to remember all these things is actually draw these little pictures like this. I realize it's a very crude drawing. It's not pretty at all, but just drawing it yourself will help you remember all these things. So I really encourage you to just get a piece of paper and draw these structures and point to them yourselves. Don't just look at the book and read the words, but actually write the words down and actually draw pictures yourself and draw arrows to things and label them yourself. The act of writing things down really helps you learn things, and drawing pictures helps you learn things too. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we have an artist drew this picture of the brain, this diagram of the brain, showing the grooves and the bulges that you're more used to seeing when you see a picture of the brain. So we have the cerebrum, the diencephalon, cerebellum, and brainstem. So we're going to look at the surface features of the cerebrum, and we have the bulges are called gyri or gyrus. Grooves are each one is called a sulcus or sulci. So here's the cerebrum. This is this whole outer region of the brain that you can see all the way around. There, just there. And then here's the diencephalon. So that's this whole bit here. Then we have the cerebellum, which is this guy here. there. And then we have the brainstem, which is all the rest of this guy going down towards the spinal cord. So that's the 4 regions of the brain. Cerebrum, the higher mental functions, as we talked about. You have interprets sensory stimuli, plans, initiates movement. So you take in sensory information, and then you decide what you want to do with that sensory information. Then you send out signals to the skeletal muscles to move muscles for whatever it is that you want to do. Whether you want to like turn your eyes somewhere else, whether you want to move your hands, your legs, run, jump, write, whatever you want to do. The diencephalon is all for processing. Well, a lot of it is relaying information from your body up to the brain. Also has a function maintaining homeostasis. We'll talk about that. And the cerebellum, it's really for monitoring and coordinating movements. So you have fine motor movements that you coordinate back and forth with your cerebellum. So if you learn to play the piano, you have and you're playing the piano, all those little fine motor movements and your balance as well are all coordinated by the cerebellum. Brainstem also helps maintain homeostasis, controls reflexes, integrates, relays information. It's where some of your automatic kind of functions are taken care of. Cardiovascular functions, respiratory rate, all those kind of things are taken care of by the brainstem. Okay, next slide. So here's a picture out of your guys' book. Unfortunately, I can't get a clear picture, so it's a little blurry, but here's the cerebrum. So this is part 1 of the brain. And we have different lobes. If you remember the bones in the brain, we had the frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, and occipital bones. So the frontal bone, parietal bones, temporal bones, and occipital bone back in the back. And so we have lobes that correspond to those same kind of things. We have the frontal lobe, we have a parietal lobe, we have a temporal lobe, and an occipital lobe. There's also some other features, and here's showing you up on the right up here, a sulcus is the groove here, and a gyrus is this bulge, here, and that's another gyrus there, and that's another gyrus there, and that would be another sulcus there. So you have so sulcus is a groove, and gyrus is a bulge up over the top. So some of the other features of the brain, we'll get into these a little bit deeper later on. But you have a central sulcus. There's a central groove that goes down the middle of the brain there. Okay, and then you have a gyrus that's in front of it, and that's called the precentral gyrus, and a gyrus. So that would be this gyrus here. And you have a gyrus that's behind it, called the post-central gyrus, and so that's this gyrus here. So you have this sulcus in the middle. Just really color that in. So you have this groove in the middle between the precentral gyrus and the post-central gyrus. That's one of the major feature of the brain involved in we'll talk about why that's important later on. So, all right, next slide. So in the previous slide, I forgot to point out there was a feature called the lateral fissure, and that would be right along here, so these two metal-looking retractors have been drawn in, and they're pulling apart the lateral fissure, exposing another set of gyri and sulci underneath, and that is called the insula. And so here's the insula. So that's what it's sometimes considered another lobe of the brain, or sometimes considered an extension of the temporal lobe, so you have the temporal lobe, the lateral fissure there, and then basically it goes like inside and makes another groove inside. So is it really part of the temporal lobe, or is it a separate lobe? It does have different functions than the temporal lobe does. So a lot of times people consider it a different lobe of the brain. So we'll consider it as 5 lobes of the brain. You have the frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal lobes, and the insula. So it doesn't have the name lobe after it. It's always called just the insula. And let's see, here's your central sulcus again. So you can notice that groove going down the middle here of the brain. And the central sulcus, so you notice the frontal lobe and parietal lobe. If you remember your bones, your frontal bone stopped about right here on top of your head. If you turn, I guess it turns a little sideways. So it's like about here. The central sulcus is back a little bit farther. So your parietal lobe is not exactly with the parietal bone, but it's mostly in that area. You notice there's just a dashed line here for what separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. And we'll see where that actual fissure is when we look on medial view of the brain. But this is actually called the we'll get into it in a second. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So we have the four lobes of the brain: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal, and the insula that you can see when you pull apart the lateral fissure. Next slide. So here's a superior view of the cerebellum. So we're looking at, so you have a left and right half. You guys have probably heard about left brain and right brain. And so there is a fissure right down the middle. You can see right there. It goes all the way from anterior to posterior. So that's the median fissure. And then you have the left hemisphere, right hemisphere. So each of these lobes are paired. So you have a left frontal lobe and a right frontal lobe. So you have the median or longitudinal fissure. You have the central sulcus there, and then you have precentral gyrus there, and you have a postcentral gyrus there. So, and then you have a left and right parietal lobe and a left and right occipital lobe. So that's a superior view, looking down on top, and you can see the central sulcus very easily. And so in front of that is the first gyrus, major gyrus you see is the precentral gyrus, and the one posterior to it is the postcentral gyrus. All right, next slide. So we talked about this a second ago. So the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and insula, what they actually do. So their functions are: frontal lobe is controlling the voluntary skeletal muscles. Also, you do intellect, your decision making, your personality seems to all be up here in the front. So in the frontal lobe, so this kind of area all the way through here, and this is just approximate. Don't follow any of these grooves necessarily. So this is all like intellect. Let's just call it that for now. Intellect. And this area through here is all for controlling skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscle control. Okay. So what that means is there are efferent fibers coming out of that, going down to the skeletal muscles. So the parietal lobe is for sensation. So this area back here is all for sensing. So this is sensing and processing. That sensory input. The temporal lobe down here is all for, so what is it next to? It's next to your ear. So you're looking at, so you got hearing is taken care of there. Also smell is taken care of down there. Occipital lobe back here is, interesting enough, your eyes are in front of your head, so this is anterior. Eyes are in front of your head, but the occipital lobe is back here, so the vision is actually taken care of in the back of the brain. And then the insula here takes care of like memory, taste, and integrates activities of the other lobes. Okay, next slide. So now we're going to look at so we looked at the exterior features of the brain: the frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal lobes, and the insula. Talked a little bit about what they do. Now let's look at a midsagittal section of the brain. So we've cut right down through the middle of the longitudinal fissure. So we have the left and right half of the brain. We cut right down through the middle of it, and then we separated them out. And this is what the inside looks like. So this is the median surface right down the middle of the longitudinal fissure. So you have the gyri and sulci. You can still see those. One major sulcus that you can see is this one right here, this parieto-occipital sulcus. So parietal meaning parietal bone or parietal lobe, and occipital, the occipital lobe. So that's the sulcus that goes down between those. So you don't see that on the exterior or the lateral portion of the brain or the superior portion, but you do see it on the medial portion. So that's why there's that dotted line there across the picture of the brain showing the division between the occipital lobe and the parietal lobe. Here's the central sulcus up here. We'll just go up around here, and let's see, what else do we want to show in this to get your orientation. Oh, here's the frontal lobe. That's just denoting that this whole lobe up here is all frontal lobe. Roughly this whole bit here, and then temporal is on the side down there. So there's the temporal lobe showing a little bit hanging down here on the side, and then we have the occipital lobe over here. So that's showing the occipital lobe back there. So we have that, temporal, and then we have parietal lobe all through there. So, and then there's a whole bunch of other features that we're going to talk about in the brain. So what we have are, let's see, I don't have a clear all. So we have a whole bunch of structures in here that we're going to learn the names of all these structures that are all listed around the outside. So don't get too worried. But so we talked about the cerebrum, and we are also talking about, so we have the other thing that's mentioned on here is the diencephalon. So here's the diencephalon region, is all of this. Draw better, it'd be great. And then the brainstem is all this region down through here. And this here is your cerebellum, which I'm covering up with my little video. So that's the cerebellum. So, okay, next slide. Here's a little bit better picture of the midsagittal section of the brain. So we have the same things, all the lobes of the brain. I'm going to talk about some of the parts of the brain and see what these things are. So we're going to start at I'm going to start with the upper part up here. So this structure right here, that's called the corpus callosum. It's a bunch of actual white fibers or axons that go back and forth between the two lobes of the brain. Because you got the two lobes of the brain, and they communicate back and forth inside each other, but they also communicate back and forth between the different hemispheres too. So these are tracks of white fibers of axons that go back and forth between the two sides of the brain. You also have some white fibers called the fornix. That's what this little guy is here. Then we have, let's see, we also have something called the lateral ventricle. That's this hole that's right here that you can see there. It's that depression there. We also have, the diencephalon region. We have what's called the thalamus. That's this area here. We have the epithalamus and the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is this area down through here. And the epithalamus is this area back up here. Sorry, drew it a little too big. It includes what's called, let's see, sorry, the epithalamus. It's a little bit higher than that. So, and that includes what's called a little gland called the pineal gland. The hypothalamus includes a little gland that's you can't see here, but it should be hanging off down here. It's called, and that would be down there, would be the pituitary gland. And we talked about how that sits inside the sella turcica. Then we also have the brainstem. So we have the midbrain, which is this region here. Then we have the pons. So we do the midbrain, that was the pons. And then we have this section called the medulla Oblongata. And then we have the cerebellum here. And there's this little triangular part here. That's a ventricle of the brain. And we'll get into those a little bit later. But just so you know, the ventricle, the fourth ventricle of the brain, there's one of them right in front of the cerebellum. There's a lateral ventricle that's up here, right underneath the corpus callosum there. So, okay, next slide. So the major brain regions. This is the cerebrum. Then we have the cerebellum, diencephalon, brainstem. So just get your orientation back as to where we are. This is the cerebrum, and then we have the cerebellum down here. Diencephalon is the upper part, and then the brainstem. This is brainstem. Is all this section down there. Okay, next slide. And here we are again showing the major brain region. So you see we've gone over the cerebrum, major parts of it, all the lobes in it. Then the next region to talk about is the diencephalon. We're going to talk about the brainstem next. So that'll be actually number 2, and cerebellum number 3, and then diencephalon will be number 4. So, and this round structure here, this is a thalamus. That's one kind of a landmark for you. As the corpus callosum is that big white area there that I was just kind of drawing in the middle of. It's another structure that's really easy to see. And here's your pituitary gland hanging down here off the hypothalamus. Next slide. So here's the brain stem. So the brain stem is made up of three parts: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So this is the brain stem. So the green is the midbrain. And you notice, and you'll see these little bumps on the back, right there and right there. So they're paired. There's actually 4 bumps. So that's part of the midbrain. That gives you, it's called the corpora quadrigemina. We're going to look at those in a second. The pons is kind of a bulge that's on the anterior side. So this is anterior, just to remind you, and posterior. Okay, and then going down is the medulla oblongata, and you notice, and so what happens here is that is the foramen magnum, and so that's where that's supposed to be an N. Sorry about that. Let me go and erase that. Oops. I'm going to rewrite that. So mag. Okay, there we go. So that's foramen magnum. So at that point is what's considered the division between the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. So right when it comes out of that foramen magnum, when it goes through there, that's the division between the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here's an inferior view of the brain, and the yellow parts are nerves, and we'll talk about those next time. So this is the brain stem here. So we have the midbrain is right here, this section here. Here's the pons. That's this bulge out part here. And then we have the, we call the middle cerebellar peduncle. We'll talk about what that is in a second. The medulla oblongata here. That's this section here. And then the foramen magnum would be there. And then you have the spinal cord starting there. Next slide. Here's a cadaver brain showing the same thing. So you see the midbrain portion is about here. You have the pons is here, and you have the medulla oblongata here, and the spinal cord going down past that. Okay, next slide. Here's a mid-sagittal view of the brain once again, and so this is all the brainstem portion, and this is the number 5 is the midbrain, portion of the brain stem. You have these are called the corpora quadrigemina, which means corpora meaning body, quadra meaning four, gemina meaning twins. So you have two pairs of bumps on the back. So what you have, and each bump is called a collicula. They're called colliculus. So there's 1, 2, and 3, and 4. So there's 4 of them on the back. If you're looking at it from a posterior view, would be those 4 bumps. And we'll see that. I'm going to show you pictures of a sheep brain dissection at the very end, so you'll see those very clearly. Just know that there's 4 bumps on the back. The ones that are superior are called the superior colliculus, and the one are colliculi, the pair of them. Each one is called a colliculus, and the one that's lower is called the inferior colliculus, or the pair of them are called inferior colliculi. So we talked about the corpora quadrigemina. Then we have what are called the cerebral peduncles, and that's right there is a cerebral peduncle. And cerebral peduncle is ped meaning foot. So it's really a connector or extension. So those are actually tracks of axons going up into the brain. That's what the cerebral peduncles are, going up into the cerebrum. Sorry. Then you have the pons. That's this number 3. So number 3 is the pons, and then number 4 is medulla oblongata down there. So this is the pons is here, and the medulla is here, going down to here, and this would be the foramen magnum there. Okay. Next slide. So that's the major features of the brain stem. You have the corpora quadrigemina, which is has the superior colliculus or superior colliculi, and the inferior colliculi. Then you have the cerebral peduncles, which cerebral peduncle goes across here and then up. Okay, so those are white fibers going up. And then you have the pons, and then you have the medulla oblongata. So those 4 features. Next slide. Here's a enlarged view. You can see so there's medulla oblongata there. You can also see the cerebral peduncles there. So that's one of them. Since this is cut in half, there would be another one closer to you. Here's the pons. That's pons. That's a cerebral peduncle, and let's see, that would be the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus there. So there's your four portions of the, that's also referred to as the midbrain. So what does the brainstem do? Well, actually, it's a connector between the spinal cord and the brain, or the cerebrum in some ways, but really the rest of several parts of the brain. It allows them to communicate. It's in a lot of ways a connecting highway. So it also coordinates some of the autonomic reflexes. The autonomic reflex is just a stimulus response, and so you have a stimulus. Say your body says, "Oh, I need oxygen," so the medulla says, "Oh, you need oxygen, so we need to speed up the rate of breathing." So there are respiratory and cardiovascular sensors there that increase and or decrease the rate and depth of breathing and rate and force of heartbeat, as well as blood pressure. Controls that, has those control centers. Also helps with swallowing and reflexes for coughing, vomiting, and sneezing. It also controls a lot of visceral functions. So there's actually a lot of control that the medulla does, because you don't have to send all that information up to the brain to think about whether you want to increase your heart rate. You just do it. So you just want there's some things you want to think about. So you delegate responsibility. So you have your brain that's sitting up here, and it's going, okay, what kind of things do I want to do today? Well, I want to read a book, or I want to go for a swim or a bike ride, or I want to go to the movies or whatever. And then the lower part of your brain, you delegate those just day-to-day activities. So, because you don't want to think every time you have to breathe, like, okay, I need to take a breath. I need another breath. You don't want to do that because that ties up all your brain functions. So you delegate that to this lower level, this medulla oblongata. And that's one. So it sits there and just does its stuff all day long. You don't even think about what it's doing. But you also the other point is we talked about earlier with the cervical vertebrae and the atlas and axis, and how the axis has the dens, the odontoid process that sticks up in there. So if you have the odontoid process, you have the axis sitting here. Well, it's not quite there. So that'd be the occipital bone there, and the foramen magnum. So then you have your let's call this your call that your cervical vertebrae 1 atlas, and call this one cervical vertebrae 2 there. And then remember, it has the dens sticking up in there. Has dens sticking up in here. So, and I've drawn them completely wrong. I've drawn them on the side. Just flip those around backwards. So, anyway, but those are supposed to be behind the posterior side. I should really erase that. That's ridiculous. Sorry about that. So, let me draw that again. So we have occipital bone, then we have your cervical vertebrae 1 and the cervical vertebrae number 2 going around the side there, and we have dens, the dens sticking up back here. So dens is kind of sticking up back here, inside of this cervical vertebrae 1. So your head can swivel back and forth. Well, if you drive that in, you can drive that dens right into the medulla oblongata and damage white fibers that are going up through the medulla, as well as do some damage to some of your cardiovascular rate centers, because those are actually on the kind of posterior side there. Okay, next slide. And we'll look at, or actually going to look at, I'll show you a picture of where those are. So next slide. So here's an anterior view of the midbrain, showing the pons is here. So that's this region here. Medulla oblongata. Sometimes, a lot of times we drop the word oblongata. We just say the medulla. And we have the midbrain portion up here, which has on the anterior side you have what's called mammillary bodies. I didn't point those out earlier. But you can see those in the sheep brain dissection. We'll show those. And then you have cerebral peduncles coming up. And you also have peduncles from the cerebellum. Those are called cerebellar peduncles, and we'll talk about those. And then there's some bulges here in the medulla. And so you have the olives, or the olivary nuclei. And the nucleus, when you're talking about the brain, the nucleus is a collection of cell bodies. So if you're outside the brain, a collection of cell bodies, of neuron cell bodies, sorry, I'll be specific. A collection of neuron cell bodies outside the brain is called a ganglion, and a collection of neuron cell bodies inside the brain is called a nucleus, and they're called nuclei because there are multiple ones of them. Then you have a pyramid, those are tracts, and then you have what's called a decussation of the pyramids, and you can actually kind of see a little bit in there, so what happens is the fibers cross over here. And crossing over is called a decussation. So that's a decussation of pyramidal tracts. So here it is in color. You have the pons, the pyramids, or the pyramidal tracts. You see this fissure down the middle down here. That's called the anterior fissure. And you have sulcus. So you have grooves, and so it's like kind of bumpy around the whole medulla, and each of these tracts have some different functions to them. So here this is called the olives because they look kind of like olives. They're sort of that kind of shape. So those are nuclei. Okay, next slide. So here's an olivary nucleus here, and here's the pyramid that we're looking at on the and so this is anterior and posterior. So this is this enlarged part here that's a lateral view, slightly posterior lateral view. So we have so you notice your cardiovascular centers are here, and your respiratory rhythmicity center is here, as well as a couple of nuclei, nucleus cuneatus and nucleus gracilis. You don't have to know those. I just want you to, you don't have to know where these things are, what these pieces are for the test. I just want you to know that these things are there, and you have these cardiovascular and respiratory centers on the posterior side of the medulla, so that if you have that dens and it drove up into the medulla, up into the skull, then you could easily damage those centers, or if you had other types of damage back there. So it just gives you an idea of what can go. I just want to give you an idea of what kind of things to look for, to think of when you're thinking about if you have any work on brain injuries, those kind of things, just to give you an idea of where things are in the body. Okay, but you don't have to know olivary nucleus, cardiovascular centers, respiratory centers for the test. I just want you to know that they are there, okay? And that the medulla is taking care of all of these autonomic functions for you, and you don't have to think about these things. I mean, you can force yourself to breathe deeply. You can think about it and say, oh, I want to take a deep breath, and you go. And so you use your skeletal muscles and do that. So especially if you're singing or something like that, you'll do that. But if you're out just running or walking around or sleeping or whatever, you don't have to worry about that. It's your medulla that's taking care of all your heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing for you. Okay, next slide. Oh, here's I found this animation online, so I thought that was kind of fun to show. So it's actually from Wikipedia. So, but you can see the little green parts down there. Those are the olivary nuclei that you can see when the skull spins back around. But you can see the longitudinal fissure of the brain right there, and then you can see the right hemisphere of the brain, all the lobes. You can envision the lobes, and you can see the anterior side, and so now the posterior side, the cerebellum, and then you can see the anterior side with the medulla and the pons all around there. So, all right, next slide. Okay, so moving up the brainstem. So what I did the cerebrum first, then went down to the brainstem, and then we'll go do the cerebellum next. But so we're still doing the brainstem. So we have the pons. So here's the pons, and so it's that fat area here sticking off the. So it's so this is anterior. This is posterior. And you can always tell that because here's your cerebellum here. There's cerebellum. It's a pretty easy landmark. So that's the pons. And the pons is composed of a bunch of white fibers that come from the cerebellum. And you see this structure right here. It might be kind of hard to envision, but that's actually a kind of a cylinder there. And it's those are cerebellar peduncles. And so here's one coming in to it here, and there's another one coming in here, and they meet and join. There's actually three of them. There's a superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncles that come there, and then they come in and they wrap around to the front and become the pons. So next slide. So, it assists the medulla with breathing and relaying information up to the brain, or information to the diencephalon, at least, the thalamus, which then goes on to the brain. So, because your cerebellum is helping you coordinate movements. Next slide. Okay, so the brain stem, the midbrain, is the last piece of the brain stem, and it's also referred to as the mesencephalon. At the very end of this, I'll go through what diencephalon, mesencephalon, and telencephalon, and what those words mean. They actually come from embryology, very early in development of the organism. So we have the midbrain has cerebral peduncles, also has the corpora quadrigemina, the corpora meaning body and quad meaning forward, gemina meaning Gemin meaning twins. So if you ever do astronomy, you can think about the Gemini twins. You can see them up in the sky actually right this evening. So then you have the superior colliculi, there's 2 of them, and inferior colliculi, there's 2 of those. These are reflex centers involved in head, eye, neck movements. Superior ones are for visual stimulation, the inferior ones are for auditory stimulation. You do not have to know that stuff for the test. I just want you to know, but it's interesting to know that there are centers that are, so these are these are some cell bodies that talk to each other and decide, and they do reflexes for head, eye, and neck movements. And so if you hear something, those centers are for reflexes. If you hear something behind you, you turn, and so that's where the reflex comes from. You don't think about it; you just automatically turn. So, or if you see something out of the corner of your eye, you turn your head, or at least turn your eyes and maybe your head and your neck to go and see what that is. And so those are those control those kind of movements, those reflexes that you aren't even really thinking about. Okay, and these rest on what's called the tectum of the midbrain. It's the roof of the midbrain. It's referred to as the roof of the midbrain. So it's like the backside as it's kind of leaning forward just slightly. So you have the you have the roof of the midbrain. So you have the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. These little bumps like that. So. And then you have your cerebral peduncle is coming up through here, and then continues on. It's that. There's that piece. So you can actually see there's the other part of it is there too. So, all right. Next slide. Here is a sheep brain dissection, and this is looking from the posterior side. So you have your cerebellum down here. This is your cerebellum. Is all this part down here. And here's a superior colliculus. Here's another superior colliculus. Here's an inferior colliculus, and here's another inferior colliculus. So you got those 4 bodies. Those make up the corpora quadrigemina. And then you have, since this is the backside, here's your occipital lobe of the cerebrum. Here's another occipital lobe here. I didn't draw those big enough. I'm just kind of circling to give you an idea. And you can also see blood vessels in there. You can see like here's a large set of blood vessels here. So anyway, next slide. I just want to show you what it looks like in a sheep brain dissection. I'll show you those slides later, but just so you get an idea of where we are. So that's the roof of the midbrain, the tectum, on which the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi sit, and then that's the top, the most superior portion of the brainstem. Next slide. So here's a summary of the brainstem. So you have starting, that's the diencephalon, so we're going to start here and cut it off there. So everything down below is all here. This slide is really meant to show spinal, cranial nerves coming off, and we'll talk about those later on. So we have the midbrain, or mesencephalon, and then we have the pons, and then we have the medulla. Is this the medulla oblongata down here? So this is so midbrain is there. Okay, next slide. We're going on.